Indigenous-Centered Reconciliation Practices. Jess Bolduc. Now, Jess is Anishinaabe French from Batchewana First Nation. She's the founder and the executive director of 4R's, which is a youth movement, a collaborative-led initiative that seeks to change the country we know as Canada by creating capacities for Indigenous and non-Indigenous young people to come together, to cultivate understanding, and to prototype action in support of a type of reconciliation that's relevant and real to young people. The 4R's are respect, reciprocity, reconciliation, and relevance. And since we know Jess pretty well, because she considers our home her landing base in Toronto, I think we could easily add a fifth R, relationships, because she is also a master, a leader, and a mentor of relationships. So Jess, over to you.
All right, so I'm just setting up my PowerPoint here because that's going to help me stay on track and not, pushing the wrong things. Anyway, I'm already off to a horrible start. Patty's like, do you need help with your slides? And I'm like, no, I got this, which is obviously a lie. So thanks, Jack, for that introduction. My computer is now frozen, so slides are also out of the picture for a moment. I appreciate you talking about the work, and I'm wondering, did I write that or did you write that? That was pretty good. So Hani Kinawea, hello everyone. My name is Jess Bolduc. I'm calling in from Bawatine, which is the word for the original place name of the area that I am in. And this land has been stewarded by the Anishinaabe for thousands of years, and is also the land of my ancestors. And so it's pretty special for me to be here, and I consider it a huge privilege to be socially distancing, to be within the context of a pandemic while also still being able to have access to land and to be in the outdoors. And so I really appreciate that a lot. What I want to talk to you about today is Indigenous-centered reconciliation practices. Jack wanted me to give him a title, and that's the one that he got. So what is that? I think, and I hope that we'll find out together. So, all right. And when you're ready there, Patty, drop to the second slide.
Okay. You can just carry on and hopefully
it'll work out. Oh, look at this, beautiful. So that's my cute little team. Jack talked a bit about the work that we do, but I wanted to add that our work is always evolving. And so, Carol, I'm grateful to hear that you're like, oh, after 30 something years or more, we're still trying to figure it out, because that's also how I feel about the work that we're doing. And sometimes it feels like we should be way beyond where we are right now. And so it's a great opportunity to just have gratitude for what we've been learning and how we've been adapting to what we've been learning. So the work of 4R's really was centered in cross-cultural relationships early on. But in the past couple of years, we've actually tried to shift the language that we use and the approach that we have to center Indigenous youth needs and visions within our work. And so it is about a relationship between everyone who needs to be a part of this work, and when I say everyone, I actually mean everyone. But yet, if we're talking about reconciliation, and we're talking about the history, and we're talking about the land and the original peoples, truly Indigenous folks need to be at the center of those conversations. And so what does it mean to center Indigenous young people in our work is like a question that we're always coming back to. Next slide, Patty. So reconciliation. I love this slide because sometimes people say that we hold a resemblance here, but also Golden Girls are great. How we see reconciliation in Canada is something that has been very much framed by the Canadian government more broadly. And the work that has been done around reconciliation has stemmed a lot from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And so that's something that has happened in Canada, and there's been Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in different countries across the world. And the reason for those is to address and in the case of Canada, the genocide of Indigenous peoples historically, but also the ways in which that systems continue to perpetuate oppression and death within our communities. And so coming into the work of reconciliation, we're often seeing it as about mending relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous folks. And what we're doing in our work is trying to actually stretch that so that we really start with truth. And the truth is oftentimes controlled, is oftentimes watered down. And we're still learning about the truths in the context of the history and the present realities of Indigenous peoples, both in Canada, but also in the United States, as well as globally. And so for us, the reconciliation piece comes in the reconciliation of relationship. And so we first think to the relationships between Indigenous and settler folks, recognizing the diversity of experiences when I talk about settler people. But for Indigenous folks, reconciliation is about repairing our relationships to our land, our relationships to our language, our relationships to our communities, and also our relationships to ourselves and our spirituality. And so we need to be able to understand that when we do that work around reconciliation, we can not only focus on the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people as being the central focus or the central place where we need to put our energy and our funding and our resources. So that goes back to sort of the work that we're doing to shift to more of an Indigenous youth-centered approach to reconciliation. And finally, for us, reconciliation also involves decolonization. And when we think about decolonization, we think about actually tackling some of the systems that are meant to keep us from thriving. And so I think some of the other speakers talked about that too, as well as you know, like historically and the systems and the policies and the practices that nonprofits have or support organizations have that actually just like keep people down when what we're trying to do is to create spaces for Indigenous young people in particular to thrive. Next slide, Patty.
Is that the right one?
That's the one. So reconciliation, question mark. We've come to a point, I think, in the discourse in Canada where actually Indigenous young people are talking about reconciliation and saying reconciliation is dead. And the reason being is because we have leadership, political leadership and other leadership talking about how Indigenous relationships are the most important relationships that they have. But yet you see the number of missing and murdered Indigenous women and Two-Spirit relatives. We see the amounts of incarceration of Indigenous people. We can talk about all of the different statistics that tell us that this relationship is not the most important relationship. And Indigenous young people, they're like, I'm done with it. I'm really quite over this conversation and this work. And oftentimes it's because the conversation has been co-opted by non-Indigenous people to serve their interests, to serve their education, to serve sometimes the need to just feel better about what is actually a very difficult history. Next slide, Patty. And so what do we want as Indigenous people? I think about this a lot, and this quote to me is a really beautiful one. And it's like, why actually are we here? Why is this work important? And to me, this quote speaks to like a moment that I think that we're all in right now. And I want to read it out loud because there's no way that I would possibly be able to speak to this better than Robin has here. And so the work of reconciliation to me is really beautifully captured in this quote. We are in the midst of a great remembering. We're remembering what it would be like to live in a world where there is ecological justice, where other species would look at us and say, those are good people. We're glad that this species is among us. We're remembering that we want to be kinfolk with all the rest of the living world. When we remember that we want this profound sense of belonging to the world, that really opens up our grief because we recognize that we aren't. The grief opens the wound. That's what grief is for, to compel us and give us a motive for love. And so when I think about that, and I think about where the work of reconciliation was, where it might be moving to, whether it's dead or alive, the work that we are doing with 4R's and the work that we're doing around Indigenous-centered reconciliations practices is about thinking about our work as healing justice. So not just like justice for Indigenous peoples, but healing justice that thinks about what do we actually have to do to tend to some of these wounds that continue to be the harms that we continue to experience as Indigenous peoples living in this place that's now called Canada. Next slide, Patty. But we're also really stuck. And so, Carol, when you were talking about these transformational thresholds, I didn't have the language before, but I have it now in this moment to sort of say that that's actually what we're grappling with in a lot of ways in Canada with reconciliation. We're at a transformational threshold. On one hand, you have Indigenous people who are saying, you know, reconciliation is dead. On the other hand, you have non-Indigenous folks who really are like genuinely wanting to understand what they can be doing differently in order for us to right relationships. But we also have on our side of things work that we need to do in order to show up differently to create those new relationships. And similarly on the non-Indigenous side, there's a different kind of way that non-Indigenous people need to orient themselves to the work of reconciliation, or even more broadly to the work of racial justice. And so in the breakout, what I want to be able to do is to speak to the work that 4R's is doing with Indigenous and racialized young people, and the work that we're inviting adult allies into as well. And so you know, I hope that through kind of taking a deeper look at sort of, as Linda says, my contribution or our contribution to the problems that we're trying to solve will breathe some life back into reconciliation. So thank you for listening. I think that's probably my time here. Looking forward to chatting with folks in the breakout a little bit more and sharing a bit more with you. Miigwech.
Okay.
Thanks for joining. Not sure if you had a choice or not, but you're stuck with me, so we'll make the most of it, I hope. I'll just give one more minute here just to make sure that everybody gets an opportunity to hop in. And I have a few more slides that I did want to share, so I'll get Patty, my helper here, to set those up. Yeah, I want to specifically name the focuses that, like, as Indigenous people and as an organization that supports Indigenous young people, the practices that we're kind of trying to tune into and to look at, because we're also seeing the ways in which that our own patterns of behavior are holding us back. And then I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the work that we do around, in Canada, we call it cultural competency, or like there's, you know, DEI or racial equity. There's all sorts of different ways to talk about you know, how do we show up in solidarity for one another, and what is the work that we need to do? And this is really kind of new thinking for me and my team. And so I wanted to share it with you all, and then kind of get some reactions and even some knowledge or wisdom about what resonates with you about the language or the approaches in the context of the work that you all are doing. So, oh, Patty, yeah, hop into the slides if you're ready to. I'm also going to try to talk slower because I am realizing I'm nervous and I'm like going blah, 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 blah. In my intro there, I kind of was talking about like, you know, like what is the reconciliation that we're trying to do? And when I say we, I'm talking about myself as an Indigenous person. I'm talking about my team, who are all young Indigenous people in their early 20s. And this is something that we've written, but to me really speaks to the leveling up, I think, that we see in the skills that we do, but also our responsibility. And what we're trying to do, like oftentimes I think the work that we're doing is oriented towards colonization and like dealing with the shit that colonization has done to our communities. And what we're trying to do is reorient into a relationship of healing for ourselves, but also for like joy and the things that bring us life and bring us a generous and abundant experience as we like walk through the world and do the community work that we're doing. So this is a quote from someone at 4R's. I said probably Ron, that's my teammate Ron, because I think this comes from some of the work that he was doing there. So I'll acknowledge him, Ron Gamlin, my little brother. Next slide, Patty. And so when over the years, we started to notice that like Indigenous young people, we kept getting stuck in our work. And it was actually causing harm for ourselves and causing harm for our communities because of these patterns of organizing that just keep coming up. And we thought, you know, like there's got to be a different way to be able to do community work that doesn't drain us, that doesn't make us feel like we've done something wrong, and also actually that we aren't perpetuating the same kinds of patterns that colonization actually has socialized us to. And so the first thing that we really thought of is like, we need to stop, you know, placating to the government and the funders and how they want to define reconciliation work, and we need to be able to think about what is the story that we want to tell about reconciliation. And so by just changing that and opening that up to Indigenous young people who have otherwise been told that reconciliation is only between Indigenous and non-Indigenous young people. We see young people doing work around language. We see young people reclaiming their culture. We see young people talking about new models of governance. We see all of this creativity and this innovation by like removing that kind of, you need to do reconciliation in this specific way. The second thing that we were noticing was that, and to me, this is tied to structures of capitalism. This is tied to the realities in our community and how much we're always sort of operating from a place of urgency or reactivity, because it's just one thing after another, after another, after another. And so this is an invitation for us to think about, how do we stop treating each other like transactions? How do we be mindful of the ways that we're extracting from one another, and thinking about the deep extraction history of Canada too as well, and how that even shows up in our personal relationships, and how do we instead look at like what reciprocity looks like, and how to sort of like think about the work that we do from that place. So as I said, we're generating abundance instead of sort of leaking our energy. And the last thing that we were noticing was like this importance of moving away from patterns of lateral violence in our communities. We have a lot of lateral violence in Indigenous communities, and this is I'll call it a byproduct of colonization, and is not something that is natural to us or really connects to our values as Indigenous peoples. But you know, generations and generations of oppression, really struggling in many different kinds of ways. There can be a crabs in the bucket kind of mentality, or you know, intergenerational trauma gets transmitted through generations. And what we're trying to do is to break that cycle and bring in a cycle of intergenerational love and kindness. And sometimes that asks of us to really look at, like, you know, like, what are the practices that we do in our organizing that are continuing to sort of build structures that limit us from achieving the futures that we actually imagine. And so this has been kind of the focuses of our work internally that we've been doing with the Indigenous young people that we've been working with, and together are really learning that, like, there is another way of doing things. But oftentimes we're the ones who sort of get in the way, I think, of the work that we want to do. And so this is that sort of reminder of, like, this is work that we can do alongside the work that we're doing to build and mend relationships with non-Indigenous folks. Patty, next slide. And so, as I mentioned, we really, so the work that we do with young people is work within their communities, but we also recognize that the work that they do in their communities is influenced by so many different things, and that our work in reconciliation is work within an ecosystem. So whether that's the different community organizations that are in their community, whether that's the way that they're getting funding or accessing funding, the way that, like, policies might impact them and who they are, what's happening in their community at the time, we recognize that all of this stuff is connected. And so part of the work that we do that's external work is trying to create some readiness within the youth sector for non-Indigenous allies who want to support Indigenous young people. And so, next slide, Patty. But we keep seeing that, and to me, I kind of witness this when I look at sort of some of the work that's been happening around anti-racism in response to the movement for Black Lives, and how performative some of this stuff can be, or how fleeting it can be, even with the best of intentions. And so the work that we're doing right now with partners and non-Indigenous, mostly adult allies who work in the youth sector, is trying to think about, like, what are some of the agreements that we want to enter in together to create a new kind of learning space with one another. And so these are some of the principles. I'm just going to share those, and then I want to hear from you folks, that we are starting. Like, this is all new, fresh stuff. Like, literally this month we started putting this together. So you're some of the first people to, like, hear about this. But these are some of the things that we're putting forward as, like, you want to commit to, like, learning about how to be an ally in the context of reconciliation. You want to learn how to build relationships with Indigenous people. You want to support Indigenous youth in their communities and in the community work that they're doing. Okay, cool. There's some things that we need to do together then. We need to get to work. And so the first, there's about 9, I think there's 9 of these that I have. So the first one is, like, facing the truth, like reconciliation, or even like a concept like racism. They're abstracted so much that people are like, this work is outside of me. It's way too big. I can't make the connections between, you know, the colonization of Canada and the way my program is run. So what we're trying to do is actually to help people to make those connections, to see the ways in which, like, as Rich Feldman actually would say, like, our history influences our movements and influences the work that we do. We also, as Indigenous people, are recognizing that you know, the impact of colonial violence is different in other communities. And so while we sort of recognize that people have come to find Canada as their home, also some people have come from displaced and colonized communities as well, and are trying to learn more ourselves and understanding what anti-Blackness looks like in Indigenous communities too, and doing that kind of work so that we're building together instead of trying to do this thing that we see often, which is like the oppression Olympics, where it's like, you know, my oppression or my history needs to be in the center, when in fact what it is us to build together and to understand each other's histories, and to support one another in that. Another sort of agreement that we're trying to bring in with our partners is getting comfortable with different ways of knowing and learning. It's funny to see someone sort of sit with an elder and then to go, I don't understand what that was about. An elder tells a story or something. And so helping people to sort of see and get used to different ways of listening, because we need to begin to listen in different ways in order for us to understand one another in different ways. Next slide, Patty. This next sort of agreement that we're working on with our partners is the reality that, like, talking about racism and confronting unconscious bias is dangerous for BIPOC folks. Oftentimes when we're put into a position of an educator, it's almost like it's our responsibility to convince people or if they don't come away feeling like they learned something, that it's our fault because we didn't deliver the content in the right way, or we didn't say the right things, or we said something that actually turned them off to being able to hear the lessons that were within the stories or the content that we were delivering. And so we want to do things differently, because we also don't want to make it about creating spaces of guilt either. And so it's about, how do we be accountable to what we're learning? How do we open ourselves up to be vulnerable? And how do we share in ways that helps us to develop new knowledge and insights together? So it's not a matter of, as Indigenous peoples, that we know everything and that we know what the solutions are going to be, but rather an opportunity for us to open up a space for us to like actually lean into a different kind of way of appreciating the wisdom and the experiences that each one of us brings from you know, our ancestors, from like our location, from like the like literal skills that we might have in the jobs that we're in. And part of this actually like means looking at the beliefs that we hold that limit us. Brene, some of the work that Brene Brown has done, I think is interesting, because it's like, you know, sometimes the biggest thing that's in the way is actually like our shame, or the guilt that we might have, or the fear that we might have about saying something wrong or doing something wrong. And so getting in more of an intimate relationship with those emotions and those beliefs that we have, we hope will help us to be able to actually like let go of some of that, so that we can bring something different in into our lives and our personal experiences. All right, next slide, Patty. I'm going to go fast because I want to be able to hold some time for chatting here. And then to build off of that last one, you know, part of the work that we want to do is getting people used to using the words white supremacy, and understanding that white supremacy is something that actually is in some ways can be defined as a culture. And even as an Indigenous person, I can perpetuate white supremacy culture, and the way that I show up, or the way that I act, or the kinds of decisions that I make with the power that I have. And so for us to do this work around reconciliation, we also need to connect it up to the cultures of white supremacy, and not feeling afraid of that language, but actually talking about it and talking about how we contribute to it, and also how we're dismantling it. And then lastly, with the work that we do around reconciliation, and in particular the cultural competency kinds of trainings and stuff like that, we see people who come in and treat us in a transactional way, and we truly believe that we can't just like passively engage in this work. We can't passively engage in the work of racial justice. We actually have to consider ourselves as part of a community. And when we're able to do that and we actually treat each other as part of community, then what our hope is that we'll actually be, those are kind of those places, I think, that where we'll start to see the right relationships that we really long for starting to actually get some roots. All right, next slide, Patty. This is the last one. So I want to end with just talking about just the beauty of being able to create spaces for Indigenous young people to like imagine these futures for themselves. And this is some work that we've done with a group called Future Ancestors out of their Canadian youth consulting firm. And so we did some work with them to like talk about like what is futurisms, and how does that connect to different communities and cultures, and what does it mean for us to be able to dream beyond just having clean drinking water. And so when I think about the work that we're doing, I think about us carving spaces for young people, Indigenous young people, and for our relatives in Black and Brown communities to be able to step into those unapologetic futures. So thank you for listening to me. Oh, last slide, Patty. I'm like, last slide, just kidding. But two questions that I wanted to throw back to the group, and I just invite anyone to, first of all, just notice who's looking to speak before you hop in, and share the time that we have, but just looking to see like what resonated with you about what I shared, and if you see any applications in your own life or context.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for that thorough, exploration and sharing of the approach that you and 4R's are doing. I actually recognize Ron. I went to university with him, and and as you were talking about your community, like literally this morning, my mom has a pen that has your community name on it, and like just these beautiful synchronicities, and it's I appreciate your approach simply because we have to go beyond the painful stories that we're holding, and but of course it's there and it's naturally there. But in the questions of my work is a lot about how are we reconstructing our futures, and how, if we were to look at the liberation of what it actually looks like for Indigenous, for African descendant people, and then in the context of European descendant folks who also have Indigenous roots to a land at some point, right? What does that look like in terms of how we are interacting with each other now in the present moment? Because a huge element, at least for me, when I'm reconnecting to my ancestral roots, my ancestral ceremonial understandings, is that the now moment is the most precious moment that we have, and it is in the now moment that we are creating exactly what's going to happen in the future. So when our bodies systems are really riled up and holding those traumatic spaces, we can start to create those traumas in our present moments, and actually sustain these old stories that we truly want to get rid of. So I really appreciated what you were saying in terms of like holding, yes, trauma does exist, but how can we bring joy into the equation? Like how can we like siphon those old stories and create new ones, and feel, because liberation is supposed to feel good, and I find that for both or at least I'll speak for my own communities as African descendant people, a lot of I'll hear young people say I can envision a future that is better. And I pause them and I say, you don't have a right to say that, because what our ancestors have been through were far worse than what you are going through right now. And it sounds a little bit rough, but I'm like, there's a lot of things that I don't have to worry about. You get to wake up, you get to decide what you're going to eat, you get to decide what clothes and they, of course, and it's like a whole story that they had just gone, because they realized that, oh wait, I'm not appreciating what I have. Anyways, I could go on forever. I was like at the seat of my pants your whole presentation, because I'm just so grateful that the 4R's is doing this work, and I would love to keep connected. Thank you.
Yes, please. I love that. A colleague and a friend of mine says, what happened to us does not define who we are and who we're going to become. And so the building our skills to be able to recognize that we are creating fractals of our future in our present moment, and like holding on to those so preciously, like to me, that's like the skills that I would love to be able to develop with folks. Would love to hear from others too as well, like building on what's being shared in the discussion, or anything that came up with you from what I had shared.
I really like the idea of lateral love, and kind of making that a practice and organizing the structures that you're gonna do. And it's really striking me in a lot of stuff that we're doing lately, because it can be a decision to act from a space of love with other people, or it could be a decision to act from a space of anger, victimization, punishment. And it just seems like our world right now has a lot of that second kind of decision making. And I'd like to see a lot more of the first kind of decision making.
Just one big smile for the presentation and the slides. And what I want to share is, along with the amazing appreciation, to emphasize the importance of truth. As white folks, we want to get to reconciliation so fast it's a joke. And very rarely, and we can look so quickly at the data that just came out of Charles Blow's article in the New York Times, that 55% of the American white people were naming George Floyd as being murdered in June, and now it's down to 28%. And the difficulty, we all want to get the community, but we don't want to name the history, and we don't want to name racial capitalism and environmental destruction. And we think we can fight racism without fighting capitalism, and we don't name it. And I think that's really important. I'm involved with the Truth Towards Reconciliation. I can't wait to invite you down to Oakland County, Jessica, because it's being led by 2 African-American folks in an all-Black community in the suburbs of Detroit, and about the land takeover of 10 other cities that became white. And I think Truth Towards Reconciliation has to be very local, and reparations have to be very local in terms of the repair and the humanizing experience you're talking about. So I just really appreciate and it is about imagining the future and the love we can have that people can really change. So I just want to thank you so much. It was very powerful. Thank you.
Thanks, Rich. I always appreciate your hospitality. So, I might hit you up. Tom, I saw that you unmuted there, and I just wanted to give you a moment to speak if you still wanted to share.
Just extremely proud to listen to you and then see you as the youngest of this group here that I can see. And just gives a great hope for the, the future that you are actually forging your own way. What I really captured my attention was that one word in one of the last slides, is using the white supremacy, consider that as a culture, and being able to define what that culture is, and to kind of remove it from the white persons versus the white supremacy as the culture, because if we could define it as these are the characteristics and behavior of the group, then any one of us, maybe not today, not now, but in the future as a group may, manifest those kind of behaviors. So I think that was really important for me to take back and say, catch myself as well as recognize, as an institution, but also on the personal interaction level, to recognize that white supremacy is not just some far away idea that's affecting my, minority status, but it is something that can be happening in each one of us, to be able to recognize it, and then be able to not be afraid to speak it as a white supremacy, right? And everybody's talking anti-racist and all that, but this is something that we could just kind of put a name, recognize it, and then always refer to it. So I just kind of stood out for me, Jessica.
Thanks, Tom. Ron, I see you wanted to share. Before you hop in, I just want to name that I think what's actually what's beautiful about that too is that by recognizing some of these like behaviors that we have, we're not leaving ourselves without by like letting go of them, right? Like it's actually making space for like more positive and loving spaces for ourselves when we kind of let go of some of this culture. Ron, you get the last word in there. There you go.
Back in the 1970s, I taught in a small school in a village called Exshaw, right beside the Stony Reserve in Alberta. Half our students came from the reserve. There were two teachers I taught with that were talking with the elders and writing down their stories because the Stonies didn't have a written language. So they were learning how to make an alphabet for them and get them a written language while these elders were still alive to tell the traditional stories. And this is going to truth. Somebody mentioned they thought there wasn't enough. I think, Patty, it was you, not enough. Ooh, okay, quickly. In the English language, we have prefixes and suffixes. What they discovered was the Stonies in their oral language had what they call an inflex. It was a syllable in the middle of the verb that told you how accurate things were when they first told it to you. So there was no rumor. You knew right up front that it was either a fact they'd experienced